Okay, so we're in God's plan of salvation, his overall scheme of redemption here. And last week we talked about the book of Judges and how, we started with Joshua, I think 2 weeks ago, and Joshua was a real bright spot. And then Judges is just, wow. I mean, talk about how unworthy we are of a holy God. Judges just shows that to the utmost degree. Even the deliverers that God raises up are not perfect people. But I wanted to start in Hebrews 11. We mentioned this at the end of class last week. In Hebrews 11, we're going to look down at verse 32. Hebrews 11, we're going to look down at verse 32, because even in a time where, especially Judges 17 through 21, where all of the evil things that were just commonplace and things that were happening among God's chosen people are just, it's hard to read. It's hard to read out loud. It's sort of icky to talk to people about. But even among times and people like this, we have some characters who are mentioned in Hebrews 11 about their faith. So in Hebrews 11, look at verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, the prophets. And the prophets. And so here we have at least, I mean, depending on if you count Barak as a judge, some people don't, some people do. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the judges, or 4 characters in Judges who are mentioned for their faith. And some of the things that we talked about last week, I mean, you talk about Gideon. This is the dude who made a golden ephod, I don't know how you say that word, and people worshiped it as an idol, and it was a stumbling block for his household. He's mentioned for his faith. Barak, I mean, we really only read good things about him, but he trusted in God to deliver during the fights and battles that he did. Samson, I mean, we talked about Samson, I think it was you, Mike, last week, talking about the bad things that we do don't negate the good things, right? And that's exactly right. But Samson, I mean, with all the problems that Samson had, Samson is mentioned for his faith. And then Jephthah, we spent, I don't know, the last couple of minutes in class last week talking about Jephthah. You talk about somebody who literally, I believe, literally offered his daughter as a burnt offering, and God hates that, never came into his mind, yet Jephthah is mentioned for his faith. And so if I see these characters, I'm kind of like, this is going to sound really bad, but y'all just bear with me here. But the bar is set pretty low. I mean, all the terrible things that we've done in our life, I don't think anybody has literally offered their child as a sacrifice. I don't think anybody's made a golden ephod that people worshiped and you were kind of puffed up because of that. And so if God can recognize these people for their faith, even with those bad things that they've done, God will do the same thing for us with all of the things that we have done wrong. God has always required that people respond to his grace with faith. And that is a super comforting thing for me. Any thoughts or comments, Hebrews 11? Yes, sir.
If I let it, I can be crushed. Mm-hmm. Even Paul knew he was soon to be more confident in salvation. There at the end, he's fought good fights, kept all that, but he called himself a chief sinner. So maybe a better approach for me, for all of us, is be remembering some of these mistakes, and that Christ's blood is cleansing. If I repented and changed, ought to really not focus on me. We'll never forget it, but it should help us, motivate us. And sometimes I find just the opposite. It's demotivating because I'm told I can focus on myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
God used them. I'll never forget, but motivate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of my beef with calling Hebrews 11 the Hall of Fame of Faith, because it has nothing to do with these people. It's the faith they had in their God. And God is the one who cleansed them. God is the one who gave the victories, all of that stuff. So yeah, thank you very much for that. Any other thoughts on this? Okay. Well, we're still not done in the period of the Judges, but with the book of Judges, we are done. So go to the book of Ruth, please. The book of Ruth, one of the bright spots in the time of the Judges is Ruth. And so if we go over to the book of Ruth, please. See if I can flip over there. With all of the darkness, I mean, really just hard to read at the end of the book of Judges, we get to the book of Ruth, which in Ruth chapter 1 and in verse 1 tells us the time period. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed. So we know that the whole story of Ruth is during the time of the judges, where some of these awful things that we read about, and that people did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king, although God already was their king, but they didn't acknowledge him as king. All of that going on. We see a bright spot. Because here we have this story where there's a famine, and this woman named Naomi, she moves her family to Moab. She has two sons who marry two Moabite women, and her husband and both sons both die. So Naomi's like, I'm going to go back to the land of my fathers, and Ruth decides to go with her. Ruth refuses to leave Naomi's side. They go to Bethlehem. There's a guy named Boaz. I'm sure a lot of us know this story, but Boaz takes notice of Ruth's character and sort of protects her, and Ruth begs him to be her redeemer, to redeem the land and redeem her because of all that whole situation. And Boaz faithfully does. Although there's someone who's closer, he faithfully redeems her. And there was a closer relative who chose not to, but Boaz does. And then let's go to chapter 4, please. Chapter 4. Talking about Ruth here. Look down at verse 18. I'm sorry, at verse 17. So Ruth has a child by Boaz. Look at verse 17. Ruth 4, verse 17. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron. To Hezron was born Ram. And to Ram, Aminadab. To Aminadab was born Nahshon. And Nahshon, Salmon. And Salmon was born Boaz. And to Boaz, Obed. And to Obed was born Jesse. And to Jesse, David. And what's even more significant about that, who does that lead to? Yeah, it leads to Jesus. And so here we have this foreign woman who's not originally of the nation of Israel, but who is in the line of Jesus, who the real Redeemer. And one of the things that we see in the book of Ruth is this whole idea of a kinsman redeemer. We're going to talk about that just a little bit more here in a second. But overall, even during this time of the judges, where there was no king in Israel, although God was their king, they just didn't choose him, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes, there is still a remnant left that is faithful to God. We see Boaz, we see Naomi, we see Ruth here, and there is a righteous remnant that's left. The majority of the nation was following their evil ways, but there was a faithful few who still had faith in the Lord. And we mentioned those four characters in Judges 2 who are, or in Judges, or I'm sorry, Hebrews 11, who are mentioned for their faith. So even among all of these terrible things happening, there's still a faithful few. Any thoughts before we start talking about kinsman redeemer, Ruth? Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. And that shows up in Matthew 1. In the lineage, you see Rahab, who we talked about was a prostitute. And then we have Ruth later on, who was not originally an Israelite, and neither was Rahab. So these people who are not even born Israelites are part of bringing about the Redeemer. It's a wonderful thing. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else? Okay. Well, let's talk about this idea of kinsman redeemer, because it is sort of weird for us today. But back in Leviticus 25, if an Israelite man died and he didn't leave behind a son, the brother of that dead man, excuse me, was supposed to take that widow as his wife to redeem the land that he owned and to provide a son so that that line could continue. You know, it's sort of a weird thing for us today, but that's just kind of the way that that they did that. And as great and righteous as Boaz is to complete this duty, because in chapter 4, there's this whole account where there is a closer redeemer. There's someone who the right of redemption was his. And Boaz was like, hey, I'll redeem you, Ruth, but I'm actually not the closest one. We got to do this the right way. And this guy, he was like, okay, I'll redeem the land. That's great. Yeah, I want that land. I'll redeem the land. Then he says, oh yeah, by the way, you're also going to have to redeem Ruth. You know, this guy. And he was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not into that. And so being a redeemer wasn't a thing that you couldn't reject. You know, you have to do this. There was a process, I guess, for rejecting that. But we see Boaz does not reject it. You know, this is something that he chose to redeem the land. He chose to redeem Ruth. And that shows a lot about Boaz. And so we're talking about redeemers here. As great of a redeemer as Boaz is in the story of Ruth, we see that the true redeemer comes through his line. And what's amazing about this is that Christ redeems his bride, the church, although we are foreigners because of our sin, and we have nothing to offer him, just like Ruth had nothing to offer Boaz except for her great character. We can call out like Ruth does. Look at chapter 3. chapter 3, verse 9. Chapter 3, verse 9, as Ruth is sort of calling out to Boaz to redeem her. Look at chapter 3, verse 9. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." Spread your covering. I really love that line there in verse 9. Spread your covering, or shadow, or cover me. When we think about Jesus today, he covers our sins. He redeems us today. We can call out the same way that God would redeem us, and he does. Okay, any thoughts on Ruth or anything, kinsman redeemer, anything there? Okay. It's nice to have that bright spot too. We got Joshua, it's pretty good. Judges is just a train wreck to read through. And then you get Ruth. In the times of the Judges, there are still people who choose God, still people who choose God. Okay, turn over just a couple pages here. 1 Samuel, over to 1 Samuel. We're going to see the final years of the Judges, the final years of the times of Judges. In 1 Samuel 1 through 9, we see Samuel, who was a prophet, and he's the last judge over Israel. What's interesting, though, is he actually says that he sets up his sons as judges over Israel, but a lot of times in our lists, we don't count them because we're going to talk about they weren't good people. They weren't good, but it's interesting that it says that. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, look at chapter 2, we'll look at verse 12. Eli, the high priest, Eli was high priest at the time, and he had some worthless sons. And in 1 Samuel 2, let's read verses 12 through 17 together. The sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. The custom of the priest with the people, when any man was offering a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. Thus they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat from you, only raw." If the man said to him, "They must surely burn the fat first, and then take as much as you desire," then he would say, "No, but you shall give it to me now. And if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. So here, these are the sons of the high priest who are taking pieces of these sacrifices and taking the best for themselves, like the fat. God said, the fat belongs to me. You burn that up, that belongs to me. And then they were allowed to eat portions of it, but what they're doing is they're saying, no, don't boil that thing. Don't, give it to me raw so I can cook it the way that I want to cook it and do all that stuff. And so they were doing all kinds of evil things. And if somebody came and corrected them, "Hey, that's not what you all are supposed to do," they would be like, "Okay, give it to us, and we're going to take it by force." Worthless men, and it was just awful. God kills them because of their lack of respect and their lack of reverence for God. And Samuel becomes the chief judge and the prophet of the land. And let's see, look over at 1 Samuel 8, please, chapter 8. There's many things that we could talk about. Just for time's sake, we're doing overall, looking at the story overall. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Let's look at verses 1 through 9. 1 Samuel chapter 8, 1 through 9. We see, Eli was a faithful man overall. He was a high priest. His sons were worthless fellows. So maybe you would think Samuel saw that and would be like, "I'm going to make sure that my children are not like that at all. I'm going to work really hard." Well, unfortunately, this is what we see 1 Samuel chapter 8. And let's read the first 9 verses here. It came about when Samuel, was old, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." And so here we see Samuel's sons are also worthless men. It doesn't specifically say worthless men like it did Eli's sons, but we see them turning aside after dishonest gain, taking bribes, and perverting justice. And it was so bad that the elders of Israel were like, look, your sons are nothing like you. Give us a king. So whatever they were doing, all the things they were doing was so bad that they were like, give us a king. We want to be like the nations around us. Give us a king to rule over us. And what they really wanted, as we read through what they said, they wanted, look down at verse 19 too. Down at verse 19. God, through Samuel, tells them all the bad things that a king's going to do, all the unpleasant things. Look at verse 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And if you think about it, all of those things that they said that they wanted from a king, those are all the things, if we go back to Deuteronomy, we go back to Leviticus, we go to Numbers, all the things that God said, I will do for you. I will do all of these things for you, and it will go well if you let me be king over you. All of those things would have already happened. It would have been a kind of a gimme, duh, check that one off, no problem. But they said, we want it like the other nations around us. That's what we want, a physical one that we can see that's going to go out of here and do all this. And that was a really big problem. So what they wanted is what God already promised them that he would provide for them. But they had rejected God as being king over them. And so really we see, just like at the beginning of the book of Judges, we talked about Judges chapter 2, verse 19, where it sort of talks about the cycle, where it just repeats over and over, where it says, even after they returned and God would raise up a deliverer, after that deliverer passed away, they did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. And they went back to them and it got worse and worse and worse. We just see that happen over and over again. Okay, any thoughts on Samuel as the last judge, his sons, or them demanding a king, although what they wanted is exactly what God had already told them he would do for them? Okay, great. Well, then we're going to move into the next time period because Samuel is the last judge. So we're moving into the United Kingdom. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me is, let's look back at Deuteronomy 17 really quick. Deuteronomy 17, please. Deuteronomy 17. So as God is giving the law, and here in Deuteronomy, Moses is repeating the things that God has already said. And really, we talked about how in Deuteronomy, he is imploring these people, remember, forget not, remember all the things that God already has done and all the good things he's promised. In Deuteronomy 17, look down at verse 14. Deuteronomy 17, look down at verse 14. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, okay, so I mean right there, when you do that, we've already seen when we get to the time of Judges, they've conquered the land, they're living in it. And you say, verse 14, I will set a king over me, like all the nations who are around me. Oh, I mean, that's like word for word what they said. Okay, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him. He shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in this kingdom in the midst of Israel. So what's fascinating to me is God had already told them, I'm king over you. I will be your king. But also, we talked about Deuteronomy for a while. Moses got a glimpse of what was going to happen to the nation afterward. He got a glimpse of all the things that would happen. And here God through Moses is telling them, look, when you go into the land, you're going to conquest it, you're going to conquer it, you're going to live in it, and then you're going to ask for a king. You're going to want to be like the nations all around you. Okay, here's how your king has got to be. And so it's also possible, I mean, sometimes we give them a really hard time for, well, why would they even ask for a king? Which rightfully so, because God himself says they've rejected me from being king over them. But maybe some of the elders of the land, sorry, is that me? Anyway, some of the elders of the land, maybe they were like, hey, remember when Moses said this? Or, hey, we've got it written down where we're in the land, we're living in it. Let's ask for a king. So both of those things can be true at the same time. They rejected God, and yet God already said, you're going to ask for a king. And so he gives them really specific instructions there for how to do that. I also want to go back to 1 Samuel. I appreciate you flipping with me. 1 Samuel chapter 12. 1 Samuel chapter 12. Because I really don't want to excuse at all the people asking for a king as, oh, well, God through Moses had already told them that they would do it and it was totally fine. I don't want to excuse that this was not a right thing for them to do. So in 1 Samuel 12, look at verse 12 with me, please. 1 Samuel 12, look down at verse 12. When you saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you, you said to me, this is Samuel talking, no, but a king shall reign over us, although the Lord your God was your king. Now, therefore, here is the king whom you've chosen, whom you've asked for. Behold, the Lord has set a king over you. And so, again, when Samuel is saying, you asked me for a king, he said, the Lord your God was king over you. So Samuel emphasizes again that this was not a right thing for them to do. God was king whether they chose him or not, and they denied him. Another thing I want to look at really quickly is over in Hosea 13. Hosea 13, please. One of the minor prophets. If you sneeze, you might miss it. But this is a longer one, so maybe not so bad. Hosea 13, and we'll go down to verse 11. Hosea 13, and really this entire chapter of Hosea 13, God through Hosea is saying that God had always done good things for them and over and over and over again, provided for them, but they repeatedly rejected him over and over again. And so if you look down at verse, look down at verse 10 and 11, verse 10 and 11. Where now is your king, that he may save you in all your cities, and your judges of whom you requested? Give me a king and princes. Verse 11, I gave you a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath. So it's clear that when God does choose a king for the people, it's not like he wanted them to choose him as king over them. And so then later, even though they have a king, they've had many kings later when they're destroyed, he says, look, I gave you a king in my anger. I gave you what you wanted, but I also took him away in my wrath when he judges them for not following him. So we do see that this was not a good thing for them to ask for a king, although God had already told them, this is what you're going to do. Yes, sir.
Verse 9, he starts by saying, it is your destruction, O Israel, that you are against me, against your help.
Yeah. Yeah, that was verse 9. Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate that. It is your destruction, O Israel, that you are against me, against your help. Yeah. And so really just repeating I am doing all of these things. And I told you, if you follow what I say, I will be all of those things for you. I'm already your king and I will do all those things, but because they were against him. Absolutely. Any other thoughts or anything thus far? Okay. All right. Well, going back to 1 Samuel, here, as we've just read over in Hosea 13, from the beginning of the kings to the end of the physical kings, it really seems like Israel's kingdom was an illustration of man's discontent with God's way. God had already told them, rely on me and everything's going to go well with you. But mankind just consistently wants to go their own way. We see things that we like that look good to us, and we choose whatever is not God over and over and over again. And I hope that makes you think of the garden, because that's exactly what happened in the garden. There was God's way, and then there was what looks right to us, and we all make that same choice again and again. So, yes, sir? Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Brett was just saying he wonders if they thought getting a king would be looked at as we're making progress. Hey, we've conquered this land, we're living in it, but everybody around us has a king. So that's just what we got to progress here. And what they're actually doing is regressing. I think you said regressing, right? Yeah. So they're actually regressing and choosing not God and going against all the things that he had told them. Yeah. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts leading up to this point? Okay. So back in 1 Samuel here, God has always expected people respond to his grace and faith. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, Samuel really recounts all of the amazing things that God had done for the nation, all of the things that God had provided for them, and yet they chose a king and they asked for a king. And he really just shows them, look, this is sort of ridiculous that you're even doing this. Just think about all that God has done for you. But you asked for a king, and okay, we'll give you a king. And the people still choose their own way instead of relying on God. Look at verse 17. Verse 17. I was wondering where this was going to come up. I knew I had this verse written down, but I was thinking about it. I was like, where is that verse? Look at verse 17. Uh, is it not the wheat harvest today? I will call to the Lord that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord by asking for yourselves a king. So all that stuff that we were talking about earlier about how, yes, in Deuteronomy, God had told them, you're going to go into the land and you're going to ask for a king. And here are the requirements. Here's what your king needs to do. It was still not right for them to ask for a king, because here God, through Samuel, says that it is a great wickedness in verse 17 by asking for a king. It was great wickedness. This was not good, no matter what God already foretold of what would happen in Deuteronomy. Okay, any thoughts before we start talking about the first king? Okay. All right, so the first king is Saul. And before Saul was ever king, there's already sort of some red flags about Saul. And I never really noticed this before. I just thought this was interesting. If you look at 1 Samuel 9, 1 Samuel 9, and look down at verse 6, please. 1 Samuel 9, and look down at verse 6, please. This is Saul's servant. He had lost some of his animals and he's looking for them. And in 1 Samuel 9, look at verse 6. He said to him, behold, now there is a man of God in this city, and the man is held in honor. All that he says surely comes true. Now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us about our journey on which we have set out. Verse 7, then Saul said to his servant, but behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread is gone from our sack, and there is no present to bring the man of God. What do we have? And so what's interesting is some people will suggest that Saul didn't really know who Samuel was, didn't know what Samuel was all about, what Samuel's purpose was. And so, you would think here's this last judge who's also a prolific prophet in these times, and Saul has to be told of Samuel by his servant. Saul doesn't already know about that. I just thought was really interesting. He doesn't know about that. Also, though, whenever Saul meets Samuel just a little bit later, he doesn't know who he is. And some people really emphasize on that. They're like, hey, he didn't know who Samuel was. Like, I don't think that's what that one's as big a deal as people make it out to be, because Samuel would travel from place to place judging the nation. And if you didn't have to deal with him, you didn't have to deal with him. So some people really point out that Saul didn't know where Samuel was or what Samuel was about. And so maybe that's just a little bit of a red flag before we even see his reign. Let's see, over in 1 Samuel 9, look at verse 16, please. Verse 16. Verse 15, God is about to talk to Samuel here, verse 15. Now, a day before Saul's coming, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel, saying, about this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel, and he will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have regarded my people because their cry has come to me. And so one of the things I really want to focus on is Saul was picked by God. He was not picked by the people. He was not picked by Samuel. Saul was picked by God to be the first king over Israel. And that's really important. He is the anointed. We're going to see the anointed one in just a minute. But Saul was picked by God with all of his faults that we're going to talk about and all the problems that Saul had. Saul was picked by God to be the first king of Israel. And that's really important. Any thoughts or anything so far? Okay. So Saul is picked by God to be the king of Israel. And one of the bright spots in Saul's reign is right at the beginning. In 1 Samuel 11, Saul gives all glory to God for defeating the Ammonites. And there are people who, when Saul was anointed to be king, they were like, who is this guy? Is he really going to rule over us? And after this battle is won, they're kind of like, hey, bring out those worthless fellows and let's kill them. They didn't want Saul to be king. What do you think about that? And Saul doesn't do that. He says, the victory that God has given today, that's it. Enough blood's already been shed. We're not going to do that. So we see Saul has a really bright spot there. But we see in 1 Samuel 10, look at verse 8 with me, please. 1 Samuel 10, verse 8. Samuel is talking to Saul here, and he says, "You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down to you to offer the burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings. You shall wait 7 days until I come to you and show you what to do." That's in 1 Samuel 10:8. He's supposed to wait 7 days for Samuel. Samuel would offer the burnt offerings and peace offerings. But if you go to chapter 13, and let's look at verses 8 and 9 together. 1 Samuel 13, verses 8 and 9. Now, this is Saul being talked about here in verse 8. Now, Saul waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So he had waited 7 days. It seems like to him, okay, I've waited as long as Samuel told me to wait, and now the people are starting to leave him. Verse 9, Saul said, "Bring to me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings," and he offered the burnt offering. And look at verse 10. As soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. So here we see Samuel through God, or I'm sorry, God through Samuel tells him, wait 7 days. I'm going to come to you. I'm going to offer the burnt offerings. He's waited 7 days. It seems like to him, okay, I've done what happened here. I've done what was said. It seems like it's been the last minute. So he offers the burnt offering himself. And you can't even make this stuff up. Just as soon as he's done offering it, here comes Samuel. And man, we just see what happens here, and it's rough. So look at verses, let's see. We'll go to verse 11. Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." This is still relatively early in Saul's kingship. I don't even know if that's a word, but in his reign, this is relatively early. And here we see that he's already going to be rejected as being the ruler. His kingdom isn't going to endure, but he says God is trying to find someone has a heart, a man after God's own heart. Let me get that out there. And he's going to take the kingdom away from you. That's got to be devastating to Saul at this point, right? Any thoughts or comments on this whole thing? Do what? I don't. Yes, sir.
Well, I was just thinking about that. I think it comes actually from chapter 10. Where Saul was hiding in the baggage, and then they went and found him and brought him out. And it's interesting, these are the words of Samuel. It says, "You see him whom the Lord has chosen, truly there is no one like him among all people." Because when Samuel then goes to anoint the son of Jesse, remember the first sign comes, and Samuel says in his heart, "This must be the Lord's appointment." And God tells him, "Don't look at the outward man, I look at the inward man." So even Samuel, who was misled by someone's appearance, Saul looked like a king. He looked like the king Israel was. So when God selected the king, God was selecting, this is what he wanted. Saul was the best one to meet their qualifications. Then God chose the king he wanted. And that's the contrast between Saul and David. Saul was the king the people of Israel wanted. David was the king that God wanted.
Wow. Yeah, that's great, because we know he stood ahead over everybody. So, this has got to be the guy. He's tall, right? So there you go, ladies. It's not about the tall guy. It's just kidding. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's
Because I can't find it. He mentions that God is selecting him. Third 9:16. I can send you a man from the land of Israel. You shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines, by the heart of my people, because their cries come to me. And first reading of that, it seems like Saul was being chosen for his military prowess. So God is saying, well, people want military leaders, so I get military leaders. But then I thought about that, well, Israel's gonna have victory because of God, not because of Saul. So really, God doesn't have to pick a military leader to have military victory. So then I was sort of like, well, then what's the point? And I think that makes, it doesn't seem to say that explicitly. I think what's been said makes no sense to me. They was just giving them what they wanted. It's his pick. That's why it says God chose him. But it does seem like he may have chosen just to give them what they wanted. And like you said, it almost seems like people wanted because of the Saul. Because it mentions that twice in the piece. And I don't know how tall anybody else is. How tall is Moses? How tall is Aaron? That doesn't seem to be important in either narrative. But here it is, they come up tall.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they point out how tall he is. I'm going to butcher where this is. I can't think of where it is, but in the account where Saul is selected, the lots were cast for Saul to become the king, although God had already chosen him, but they'd cast the lots and everything, where he was hiding among the baggage. I think later on, I don't think we've gotten there yet. I'm going to ruin this, but later on, God through Samuel says something like, weren't you the one who was humble in your own eyes, something like that, something along those lines. You used to be humble in your own eyes, but now that you're the king and you've been puffed up and all this stuff, now you've really rejected me. So there is a transformation of Saul that we see. He isn't always the Saul that we're going to spend most of our time talking about, but he used to be humble in his own eyes. You know, he had already been told, the Lord is choosing you and been anointed, and you're going to be the king over all Israel, and yet he was hiding. You know, and I don't know how tall the baggage was, because if he's hiding and he's tall, it's some tall baggage. Anyway, but yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a transformation that happens in Saul. Somebody else have a comment? I thought I saw a hand. Yes, sir.
So to add that, you know, what we see happen with Saul isn't really much different than what happens with goodness. People that God raises up to be a deliverer that end up going.
Yeah, absolutely. And we even saw where God told Samuel, this time tomorrow, you know, I want you to anoint this man. He says he will deliver, you know, my people from the hand of the Philistines. So even in being, he's sort of called a deliverer, just like the judges were. So yeah, absolutely. We absolutely see that connection. Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Saul here. Samuel made it really clear in 1 Samuel 13 that it wasn't just because Samuel told him, wait 7 days and I'll offer the burnt offerings. He says, you've forsaken the Lord's commandment. So it was a binding commandment from the Lord. It wasn't just Samuel saying, hey, wait 7 days and I'll do it. And then because of that, it was the commandment of the Lord that Saul had rejected. He didn't respond to God's grace with faith. You know, it seemed like it was the final hour of the seventh day, and Saul was like, well, all the people are leaving. I've got to offer the burnt offerings. But right away, I mean, Samuel was there. So he had to act on his faith and not go after his own will. So God was seeking out a man after his own heart. That was not Saul. Saul had shown he would put his own will ahead of what God had told him to do. And that's just like the period of the judges. And we sort of see that with the rest of Saul's life. Saul in 1 Samuel 15, he was told to completely wipe out the Amalekites or the Amalekites, depending on how you say it, the Amalekites. And Saul keeps Agag, the king. He keeps him alive. He keeps all the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good. They only destroyed the bad stuff. And when Samuel confronts him, Saul blames the people twice. I mean, he even says, if you look at chapter 15, look down at verse 13. Down at verse 13, Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed are you of the Lord. I have carried out the command of the Lord. He knows he didn't kill Agag. He knows they kept the best of everything and only destroyed the worst. Look down at verse 20. Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord and went on the mission on which the Lord sent me and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Verse 21, but the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest of things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And so as a result, Samuel reminds Saul that his kingdom will not endure in his family line. Look down at verse 26. Verse 26, Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. As Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Also, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. Then he said, I've sinned, but please honor me now before the elders of my people, before Israel. Go back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back following Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. So here we just see that whatever, it's kind of like the first generation that was coming out of Egypt compared to the next generation. That first generation just had fundamental flaws or problems with them that sort of arose even after God showed time and time again. And here's Saul, where this is another time where he has rejected the word of the Lord and not completely done what God had told him to do. And as a result, the kingdom was taken away. And throughout the rest of Saul's life, we really see him just filled with envy and filled with hatred for his successor, David. And we see that David is sent out by Saul. I'm not going to talk a lot about David's younger years because we're doing an overall, but David is sent out by Saul multiple times to lead his army. And God gives David victory after victory after victory. And although David is already anointed as the next king, David gives honor over and over and over again to Saul. And he keeps winning victory after victory after victory. And really, this only benefits Saul, but Saul is filled with envy and hatred for his successor. And he gets so tired of winning, David winning, he got tired of winning that he even tries to kill David. And he tries to kill his own son for defending David in 1 Samuel chapter 20. We see where Saul kills 85 priests and all of their families, 85 priests and all of their families because they helped David. We see where, look over at 1 Chronicles 13, please. 1 Chronicles 13. 1 Chronicles 13 here. We're going to notice something about the Ark of the Covenant during the reign of Saul. So 1 Chronicles 13, and we'll look down, let's see. We'll look down to verses 2 and 3. 2 and 3. This is actually during the reign of David, but we're going to see something mentioned about Saul. So 1 Chronicles 13, verses 2 and 3. David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you, and if it is from the Lord our God, let us send everywhere to our kinsmen who remain in all the land of Israel, also to the priests and Levites who are with them in their cities, with pasture land, so that they may meet with us. Verse 3, and let us bring back the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul. So the Ark of the Covenant, which is the literal representation of God's relationship with the nation, God's presence with the nation during the days of Saul, no big deal. You know, I mean, that's a huge, important thing that we have to notice is that during the reign of Saul, it says, you know, we didn't seek the Ark of God. We didn't seek the Ark of the Covenant. What wasn't that big of a deal during the reign of Saul? And we see how Saul's reign turned out. It didn't turn out very good at all. And near the very end of Saul's reign, we see over in 1 Samuel 28. We'll look at 1 Samuel 28. This is just one of it. It's really an awful thing to read. But 1 Samuel 28 and verse 6. 1 Samuel 28, verse 6. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. So when Saul did inquire of the Lord, no, the Lord didn't answer him. Didn't at all. And actually, in the context of 1 Samuel 28, this is where he is about to inquire of a medium, a spiritist, which is just objectively against what God had told them to do. It really is a sad picture of Saul. And ultimately, in 1 Samuel 31, Saul dies by his own hand in battle. Him and his sons all die in that battle. And really, the entire reign of Saul, I'd say the majority of the reign of Saul, is him going his own way and then receiving the consequences for it. Any thoughts on Saul as the first king over Israel? Okay. Well, the people wanted a king, and I really love what you said today, Eddie. God gave them the king that they wanted, and we could ask the Dr. Phil question, how's that working out for you? It's not working out very well at all. And then we're going to see the next king is one that is a man after God's own heart, and it's going to be some the same, but very, very different. Thank you all very much.